Holocaust denial, we thought, had been finally put to rest with the humiliation in court of David Irving, its most articulate exponent. Now, however, there's a more subtle attempt to normalise the Holocaust, trivialise it, obfuscate it, which is what I'm investigating in this second of two programmes for the BBC World Service. The first mass killings of Jews during the Holocaust took place in the Baltic states. In Lithuania, Jews didn't end up in concentration camps. Instead, they were rounded up near their homes, often by their neighbours, tossed into specially dug pits and shot. Yet the large and popular Museum of Genocide Victims in the capital Vilnius doesn't mention the Holocaust. Yiddish professor David Katz.
It's a basic moral issue for the Baltic states and for Lithuania, which has the highest proportion of Jews killed in the Holocaust in all of Europe, that its museum dedicated to this topic, to this word genocide, excludes the genocide that occurred in its borders and with the massive participation of the very people that this museum disgracefully glorifies as some kind of freedom fighters. This is all interconnected.
Following almost half a century of Soviet domination, the Baltic states are trying to find their own independent identities. They've known what it is to be subject to the horrors of both communism and Nazism. But the story about winning independence from the former is a more comfortable one to base a national identity on than the history of collaboration with the Nazis. A necessary prelude to Holocaust denial or obfuscation is to highlight other horrors and judge that they are as bad or even worse. Anti-Zionism, too, minimises the Holocaust when it insists that what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians can be equated with what the Nazis did to Europe's Jews. Anthony Julius is the solicitor responsible for the defeat in court of Holocaust denier David Irving.
This is a picture of Anne Frank with a keffir. And the implication is that the Jews, the Zionists, have become the new Nazis.
Whether you find that offensive or not, is it actually anti-Semitic?
Yes. Characterising Jews as Nazis is a defamatory characterisation, and it's also malicious. The thrust of the characterisation is you are as bad as your worst persecutors. You have lost your moral standing, which you assert over us, because there's always an element of resentment in the characterization. You've lost. You're now no better than us. In fact, you're worse than us. You've lost your privileged position as victims, and it is, again, an extremely well-established trope in anti-Semitic discourse to be characterized most succinctly as the persecuted become persecutor.
John Mann, a Labour MP in the UK, is a founder member of the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism.
Nobody calls the Zimbabweans and Mugabe's regime Nazis. No one calls the Sudanese Nazis. No one calls the North Koreans Nazis or the junta in Burma. Evil and bad though all of them are by any stretch of the imagination. But that choice of the language is particularly intended to offend, to demean and to undermine. And that's what anti-Semitism is. That's what racism is.
Holocaust denial, it can be argued, is in itself anti-Semitic, racist, because it requires the belief in a global Jewish or Zionist conspiracy, ruthless and powerful enough to have invented it. Two of the most influential conspiracy theories are the fake protocols of the Elders of Zion and Hitler's Mein Kampf, traditionally associated with the far right. John Mann.
The concept that the Jews are to blame, that the Jews are the hidden hand, is part of that, and the fact that you can buy, as I've done, a copy of Mein Kampf on the Edgware Road in London, in the heart of a Muslim community, demonstrates how dangerous this logic becomes, because, of course, Hitler and the Nazis were started with the Jews, but if there had been Muslims around in Germany, they wouldn't have survived the war any more than other minority groups. That shows the obscene irrationality of some. But why on earth are the copies of Mein Kampf circulating in that way? Why are the protocols of the Elders of Zion been rewritten in different languages? In Turkey, it was the leading seller for some time last year. What on earth is going on? What is the motivation of people producing documents of hate, lies from the past?
Such lies from the past thrive in the Middle East. President Ahmadinejad of Iran has repeatedly called the Holocaust a lie. The Islamist movement Hamas refuses to have it taught to children in Gaza. The Holocaust is a lie invented by the Zionists, it says. Take that view, of course, and Holocaust denial seems tempting as a strategy to delegitimize Israel. Muda Zarain is a Palestinian academic and writer now living in Britain as a political refugee.
One of the means of undermining someone else is to undermine their suffering. The mere fact of undermining the magnitude of the Holocaust, to me, is just as bad as those who try to justify it and say it was justified. The Holocaust revolved around killing people for their ethnicity, and on a mass scale with the intention of wiping them out. To compare that to other atrocities, be it the gulags or anything else, is quite, I think, an insult to intelligence and insult to those people who died.
David Hirsch, a sociologist at the University of London, believes the Israeli occupation to be illegitimate, kept in place by a regime of violence and humiliation. But that, he says, is a long, long way from equating it with the Nazis' campaign to murder Europe's Jews.
If you say Israelis are Nazis, then what you're saying is that Israel carries out crimes which are comparable to the extermination of a whole people. And if you think that that's happening in Gaza or the West Bank, then you just need to read some books about the Holocaust and find out that it's not the case. There never has been a genocide of Palestinians. There are no Israeli gas chambers. There are no Israeli concentration camps. There are no Israeli Einsatzgruppen. The number of deaths on both sides throughout the conflict are analogous to the number of murders that the Nazi regime routinely committed kind of every few minutes, really.
In today's Eastern Europe, Holocaust denial is not an option. There are too many mass graves. One holds the remains of 10,000 Jews, shot in a single day, nearly half of them children. But there is a new and more insidious phenomenon. Ultranationalists are insisting that the crimes of the communists were just as bad as the crimes of the Nazis. Professor David Katz coined the term Holocaust obfuscation, a blurring or confusing of the historical record, which minimises the unique horror of the genocide against the Jews. On top of all this, Jews have been accused of being behind communism, and a recent poll revealed 31% of Lithuanians believe them to be responsible for their own persecution. John Mann again.
If we look at history, we see that, the communists did us a lot of damage, and they certainly did murder a lot of people there. The Jews were communist. Look at Lenin. In fact, all Jews were communist. But what underlies this irrational thinking is that, of course, in these countries there's still a small elderly Jewish community who's Russian-speaking because of their history. That proves the case then. They all speak Russian. Proved the point. That's said very deliberately. They were the communists. Therefore, they were our enemy. And what that does is it excuses the fact that Lithuanians and Latvians took out their Jewish neighbours, took them to the woods and shot them in huge numbers, a majority of them. And this attempt to equalise history is perhaps the most insidious form of anti-Semitism around today. And this is spreading across Eastern Europe.
I'm in Lithuania in the Baltics, once home to one of Europe's most vibrant Jewish communities. 95% of them were murdered here, the highest percentage in Europe. Yet today, anti-Semitism is very much alive and kicking in this part of the world, and the ultra-nationalists here stand accused of hijacking history.
It's a basic moral issue for the Baltic states and for Lithuania, which has the highest proportion of Jews killed in the Holocaust in all of Europe, that its museum dedicated to this topic, to this word genocide, excludes the genocide that occurred in its borders and with the massive participation of the very people that this museum disgracefully glorifies as some kind of freedom fighters. This is all interconnected.
David Katz was Professor of Yiddish at Vilnius University for 11 years, but says he lost his job after condemning what he saw as distortions of the Holocaust story. His concern is that nationalists here are pushing one particular version of history. For example, their 2008 Prague Declaration, which includes a demand for an overhaul of European history textbooks, is making good progress through the European Parliament. Its request for a single commemoration day for victims of both Nazi and Soviet crimes has already commanded a majority vote.
Without denying a single death, the obfuscationists excel in confusing the issue, in distorting, minimizing, trivializing, raising other crimes to that alleged level of genocide, and a whole host of tricks to so confuse the issue that the word and the category and the notion Holocaust is deleted from European history.
How did this start? Who's behind this?
It started right here in the Baltic countries. And it started because the Baltic countries face a very difficult problem in dealing with their own history. Now, the mature thing is to cope with all the dark spots on all our histories, because every one of our nation's histories has very many sad and shameful episodes. But Holocaust obfuscation arose as a ruse, as a box of tricks by ultranationalists, anti-Semites, and the far right to cope with it in a dishonest way, to try to erase the stain from history without engaging in denial. You can't deny anything here. These countries are full of hundreds of mass graves where their entire Jewish populations lie buried. What basically started as anti-Semitic discourse has evolved tragically in the years after Baltic independence from the Soviet Union into a sophisticated paradigm with fancy words in the hands of academics, politicians, journalists, and other elites who are out to convince all of Europe, not only their own people in the Baltic states, to adopt the new model of two equal genocides.
87-year-old Melach Stalevich survived the Holocaust, but his family did not. They were among the tens of thousands of Jews thrown into a pit in the forest of Ponar and shot. What does he make of the double genocide claim?
It's a big joke. It's being told by actors, trying to deceive the outside world into believing they were somehow victims here. The truth is that many were deported, and not only stayed alive, but also got into higher education and found jobs.
That wasn't to be for your family.
What happened to my family was very different. In 1941 they were stripped and humiliated, shot and tossed into one of many huge pits along with tens of thousands of others.
Do you think it could ever happen again here in Lithuania?
If the world again closes its eyes to what is happening in places like this, yes, it could happen again.
Which is not scaremongering. Earlier this year, a court here legalised the public wearing of swastikas, saying they were part of the country's cultural identity. Szymon Alperovich is chairman of the Lithuanian Jewish community. He escaped to Russia during the Holocaust. His family stayed behind and were all murdered.
Tas mums labai nemalonu, mes nepritarėm.
It's not that these swastikas are hurting. The reactions of the society and the ignorance, this is what is hurting. Because once it happened to the Jewish people, and these were the swastikas, the next day it can be not the Jews and not the swastikas. But if we will be ignorant, these things can repeat.
We're in the Museum of Genocide Victims in Vilnius, and what's striking as you walk around is there's no mention whatsoever of the Holocaust. There's nothing, there's no exhibits, no placards, nothing to tell anyone visiting this museum that 200,000 Jews died in this country during the genocide that everyone knows about. Where I'm standing now, there's an exhibit that's celebrating the political art of the anti-Soviet partisans here. And a couple of the cartoons look distinctly anti-Semitic to me. I've got the Star of David on a bowl and Stalin's blowing bubbles with the Jewish soap powder. There's another one where Stalin and Lenin are in a jeep, and there's a third sort of caricatured Jewish person next to them, and it says, "The little Jew Junkerler." Now, school children coming here, what are they going to make of that? The horrors perpetrated by the communists need to be exposed and publicised. Nobody argues with that. This is not a competition in suffering. Yet the fact is that 200,000 Jews were killed here in less than 6 months. Why, I asked the director of the Centre for Genocide Research, is the Holocaust not even mentioned in their Museum of Genocide Victims?
The tradition of this museum is to provide information about the Soviet occupation and Soviet repression, nothing else.
Your very centre, the Centre for Genocide Research, sits on the very site where the Vilnius ghetto was, where thousands of Jews were rounded up and murdered. Why, for example, is there no plaque outside?
Memory is not only about marking a place with a stone or plaque. And of course, there is a Holocaust museum elsewhere. We provide maps showing people who come here how to get to it.
Well, obviously, that's just one of the popular excuses. The Holocaust exhibit is in a small wooden greenhouse up a hill that no tourist has ever chanced upon if they haven't been looking for it, whereas this is a major state-sponsored museum right smack in the middle of the city, called the Museum of Genocide Victims, although it omits the one genocide that occurred here. So it's right out of George Orwell. And if you look at the bigger picture, it's part of the big investment in tricking Europe into changing and revising the history to delete the Holocaust as category. Look at what's happening, Wendy. You see that in Europe, these forces are proposing double genocide, equality of genocides. But when you come to their own capital cities on the ground, it's back down to one genocide. And guess what? It's the one that wasn't a genocide.
I'm off now to the city's Holocaust Museum, but it's actually quite hard to find. It's tucked away here at the top of a steep driveway. You can't see it, it's invisible from the street below, and it's somewhere that you'd really have to seek out.
It is a heavy crime, of course, of the Soviet regime.
Rachel Kostanian, director of the Holocaust Museum.
But the difference with the Jews is one main difference. The Lithuanian as a nation survived. They are here, they have schools, operas, theaters, high schools, etc. The Jews have nothing because they are dead.
One exhibit in Rachel's museum is a log of the daily death toll kept by Karl Jaeger, a Nazi SS officer. September the 1st, 1941, he writes, 1,763 Jews, 1,312 Jewesses, and 1,404 Jewish children. His final totting up is nearly 150,000 human beings. Mission successful, he boasts. How does Rachel feel about the current political trends?
Anger, of course. I was angry, very angry. Again, it's a falsification of history. It is the repeating of the stereotypes. It is the thought that where is the world going to? Where? What future is for the world? What future awaits my grandchildren?
It's time to seek an official explanation of why the Museum of Genocide Victims is silent on the genocide against Jews. Giving it to the BBC World Service is the Prime Minister's spokesperson, Virgis Valentinavičius.
Basically, it's a KGB jail museum. It's a different story, and I think the name is not very fortunate, and we will be working to somehow change that.
Why not look at what happened under the Soviet occupation here as a distinct, separate issue? Because always putting it together with the Holocaust does run the risk of distorting and minimising the real unique horror of the Holocaust.
All these things are things of the past, basically, and Holocaust tragedy and Stalin-inflicted tragedy, they are matters of the past.
Just since I've been here, I'll show you, I saw this, which was on the front page of a newspaper. Now, this is, a picture of a Jew holding up the world with the headline, Jews rule the world. This would not happen in other European countries, on the front page of a national newspaper.
It would happen in England if England has a court system as it is in Lithuania, where our courts are, for the time being, too weak, and lack knowledge to deal with such an issues in a proper way.
What I asked him about the accusation that his government is trying to rewrite history.
No, we are not trying to rewrite history. There are two extremes. One is that Lithuania is a country which is 100% populated by unrepentant Holocaust killers and zoological anti-Semites. Other extreme is that Lithuanians did nothing bad and they just saved Jews and everything. Some of Lithuanians stick to this last extreme. Some of the Jews stick to the first extreme, and the truth is somewhere in the middle.
For the few Lithuanian Jews who escaped the Nazis, the Soviets seemed to be their only hope. With no British or American troops to turn to, the tiny number of escapees joined up with Soviet-supported anti-Nazi partisans. Now, astonishingly, some of these survivors, in their late 80s, remember, are being hounded as war criminals. David Katz.
In 2006, the state launched a campaign of war crimes investigations, not against Nazi war criminals who were never investigated seriously here, but against Holocaust survivors in their 80s who are alive because they escaped the ghettos to join up with the resistance in the forests of Lithuania. In 2008, things deteriorated more here when police came looking for two magnificent, brave women who are heroes of the free world, Rachel Margolis and Fania Yochales-Bransovsky, both escapees of the Vilna ghetto who joined up with the partisans and fought heroically against Hitler.
One of these women, 88-year-old Fania Bransovsky, lost her entire family and was one of the last Jews to escape the Vilna ghetto. She walked 43 kilometres in fear of her life before reaching the anti-Nazi partisans. What does she make of now being denounced as a communist war criminal by state prosecutors and the mainstream media?
Es ist sehr leicht, ihn aufzugeführen zu ihm.
It could be that the very difficult economic situation here is playing some part in all this. After all, we Jews have a long history of being singled out as the enemy. What really lies behind this is that people do not know their history and do not understand, and it is in certain people's interest to keep them in ignorance. It's so important for us that they know the truth.
The Prime Minister's spokesperson responds that the government is even now trying to persuade state prosecutors to drop their campaign against survivors like Fania. David Katz is not convinced.
They are neither charged nor cleared. Nobody is going to charge them or try them. It is all part of the obfuscation movement to create a bogus paper trail of investigation. The plan being that they will leave this world as war crime suspects, so the history books will be able to say our prosecutors investigated Soviet and Nazi war criminals, but they all died before we were able to bring these investigations to a conclusion. It's a very nasty ruse.
Government here does not control directly prosecutors and cannot issue orders for prosecutors. It's an independent institution. We cannot do that. Government's aim is to deal with this issue for good. And that will take a lot of time, a lot of education, a lot of political will, and consistency.
Virgis Valentinavičius. In the post-war period worldwide, anti-Semitism seemed to have lost its virulence. Yet today, there are very clear signs that it is again becoming virulent. There's the increase in the examples of anti-Semitism. There's the trend that begins with dislike of Israel and ends with hostility to Jews. And there is the political manipulation and obfuscation of the Holocaust, potentially so much more dangerous than outright denial, because it could gain acceptance in mainstream society in a way denial never could. Final words go to award-winning writer Howard Jacobson, first on why the state of Israel is so important to Jews worldwide, no matter what we think of its policies and actions.
Country after country kicks Jews out. Out you go, go where the hell you like. The idea that such countries can now say, we've kicked you out, but we are absolutely appalled that you might now have decided to find a place where you would like to congregate and say you would like it to be mainly for you. You can't kick people out and then determine what they do when they go somewhere else. Given the history of them, it makes perfect sense. They would be mad not to do so.
And then there's the fear among Jews today, which in the places I visited for these BBC World Service programmes, Sweden and Lithuania, is almost tangible. What I found there brought to mind my grandmother's advice. Always keep a bag packed in case we need to flee. Paranoia or a justified worry.
Any Jew is entitled to feel that Kristallnacht wasn't exactly Kristallnacht until it happened, and you can't expect any Jew, there are still Jews alive who remember all that, not to be worried that that could happen again. I know lots of Jews who go, it's changed, you're too old, we're younger, such things don't happen again, the whole world's changed. The whole world has never changed. This has been going on for 2,000 years. What now? What now about humanity would it be that would make us feel that the whole world's changed and Jews are forever safe, and if only they'd bloody well get out of the occupied territories, everybody would love Jews again? Oh yeah?